So moving on then to our next section of this, the historical Muhammad. Which of course subject you studied at Oxford recently. Could you just give us a very accessible overview of the issues in Western academic circles to do with the historical Muhammad?
Yeah, so when it comes to the historical Muhammad subject, there will be some issues and difficulties that we encountered in the historical Jesus subject, which we would actually encounter here also. So we have various sources at our disposal. And so now the question is, how do we learn about the historical Muhammad? There is first and foremost the Quran. And so many times you'll frequently come across scholars who say that, the Quran does not say much about the historical Muhammad. And so, we cannot really say much about him on the basis of the Quran, and you will also come across various scholars who actually deny, who actually give the Quran, who place the Quran at a rather late date. So they would, view the Quran as sort of like a composite document written by different people at different times and places, ultimately reaching its final form sometime in the Umayyad period. These days, scholars are generally not convinced by such constructions, and the reason is firstly because you've got now manuscripts. Many of them have been carbon dated, which go all the way back to the first Islamic century. The earliest one being, I think, the Sana palimpsest in the first half of the first Islamic century. So that is, from the time of the Sahaba. And so, we can safely therefore say, or simply on the basis of the manuscripts, that the Quran emerged at a very early point in time. During the time of the Sahaba themselves, that we can simply on the basis of the material evidence, we can trace it very close or all the way back at least to the third Caliph Uthman, when he issued his copies.
And I just want to obviously mention that people can watch a discussion I had with Dr. Sidki just a week ago. He's an expert on the Quranic manuscripts. He's the new executive director of the International Quranic Studies Association. And he talks us through the historical evidence, and indeed it is showing that the Quran, essentially we have today that the same Quran is found in the earliest manuscripts. There's been no significant changes at all in the transmission of that. But still, how much does the Quran tell us about Muhammad, and what other sources are there about his life that we can rely on?
Indeed. So a few words need to be said about the Quran. So now that we can situate the Quran at a rather early date as a completed corpus, then the question is, how do we utilize it, and what can we know about the historical Muhammad? Now, one point which the late Patricia Crona pointed out in one of her essays, which is available still on the Open Democracy website, was this, that, while we may not be able to construct a biography of the Prophet on the basis of the Quran, that is to say that, day one, he went to this location, then he went to that location, then he said this, someone else said that, you can't do that with the Quran, but it gives you access to his preaching. So what he believed were revelations from God, and he is preaching that to the people. So if you want to ask questions such as, what did the Prophet believe about God? What did he believe about the prophets? What did he believe about good deeds, about the afterlife, about heaven and hell, the angels, etc.? Then, the Quran is then a very useful source because it gives you, direct access to his preaching. So that, while we cannot construct his biography, to know his preaching, what he stood for, that is no less significant, and in fact, would be very significant. I mean, just to very quickly compare this with the historical Jesus subject, if you want to know about what Jesus preached specifically, okay, you can say a few things, but not that much. You can't say a lot about his preaching on a variety of subjects. You can say, okay, he talked about the kingdom of God. He talked about, having this strong belief in God and a few other items. Compared to this, the Quran contains more details about the preaching of the prophet. Now, this doesn't mean that, okay, we can simply, read the Quran and that's it. One still has to overcome the hurdle of interpretation, because it's absolutely possible that people can disagree over the interpretation of some passages or many passages in the Quran. So be that as it may, nonetheless, if one wants to know about the preaching of the prophet, the Quran is there. That's the main use of the Quran. And more recently, I would like to mention a scholar by the name of Walid Saleh, who is, I think, in the University of Toronto. So he wrote a very interesting article. It's a two-volume article. So the first volume is The Preacher of the Meccan Quran, Deuteronomistic History and Confessionalism in Muhammad's Early Preaching, in the Journal of Quranic Studies. And he believes that we can actually, from the Quran itself, know certain things about the historical Muhammad. So just to quote him very briefly, he says that the Quran is packed with information about Muhammad, and he believes that the most important details about Muhammad in the Meccan Quran, let me just quote him again. He says that we can obtain historical information about Muhammad, his community, and their respective ideas. And just to give you a few very quick summarized example, he says that, prior to his ministry, Muhammad was not active as a soothsayer, that he was acting on his own with no group or cult behind his mission. The Meccan unbelievers were worshippers of an ancestral cult, and they did not uphold the notion of one universal truth, and they admitted their religion was not scripturally based. And there is also the insistence in the Quran upon Muhammad's humanity and his physical nature. And, it defines his messengership, where human messengers merely convey God's message. So this is just quickly summarizing what Walid Saleh says. So he says that we can actually, say a few things about the historical Muhammad and about his community. But even if that is the case, it would mean that we would gain an atomistic look into the historical Muhammad, that we won't be able to construct a biography. So the main utilization of the Quran would be to understand the preaching of the Prophet Muhammad. Besides the Quran itself, there is a large pile of material which goes under the heading of tradition or a hadith, and here there are several disagreements among scholars. So hadith, basically, sayings attributed to the Prophet, or sayings attributed to his companions. Not all of the hadiths necessarily present information about the Prophet himself, or something he said. So hadith we can view, sort of like a report, which can be either conveying something about the Prophet himself, about something which he allegedly said and did, or maybe some information which a Sahaba said about various matters. So there is a lot of disagreement still among scholars on the way we should utilize the hadith material, and if it can be utilized at all. So you'll come across some scholars who simply make no use of the hadith. Some scholars who would say, okay, that there is an authentic core here, but we can't say much more than that. Some would say, okay, there are some nuggets of historical information, but there are other scholars in the recent years who have given a pushback, against such sort of views and opinions. And their stance is that this material really needs to be taken much more seriously, and you have to look at the material on a case-by-case basis and then draw a conclusion. And whatever conclusion you draw upon your analysis of, let's say, a particular tradition, that cannot be generalized upon the entirety of the hadith material. It could be that you look at another tradition in detail and your conclusion would be very different about that tradition. So they're advocating a case-by-case approach. They're not saying that all of this material is authentic. They're not saying that all of this material is inauthentic. What they're advocating is that let's look at it on a case-by-case basis.
And would it be associated with very distinguished scholars like Harold Motzky, for example?
Indeed. So I'll come to that.
He's a very key figure who challenged this prevailing skepticism towards the Hadith corpus in recent years, precisely on the grounds that you've just discussed.
Exactly. So just before I get to Harold Motsky, there is one scholar, Dr. Najm Iftikhar Haider, his article in the publication Dare Islam, 2013. Let me just quote one bit, just so you get a sense of where modern scholarship stands at the moment. So this is what he says, that there is a growing scholarly view that traditions were being recorded without wholesale fabrication in the early 2nd or the 8th century Muslim world. And likewise, Gregor Scholler, and I'm quoting this from his work, English translation of his work, The Biography of Muhammad, Nature and Authenticity, 2011. He writes, we could reconstruct on the basis of the sources available reports which go back to persons in very close contact with Muhammad, sometimes even to eyewitnesses of the events. In the intervening period between the appearance of that book, so he is referring to his earlier German study, and this, what I'm quoting from, further studies have exemplified and confirmed my thesis. So as some of these scholars, and this includes Harold Motsky, have looked into this material in more detail, they have come to the conclusion that firstly, the tradition, the isnads are the chains of transmission, that it's not the case that, in the early 2nd century, people were just, making it all up and just fabricating this, as Dr. Haider mentions. And at the very least, more scholars are now willing to grant that in this large pile of material, we do have early material, which at the very least, goes back to the 2nd century. And then increasingly, scholars are arguing that once you look at the material in more detail, you can come across information which was already circulating in the 1st Islamic century also. So it's not like that, Bukhari and Muslim, who appear later, were, just one day sitting down and just making stuff up. No. They are collecting the information that they were familiar with, which was already long circulating. They were not like making it up.
Can I just give a precise example of that? Drawing on this work, a book I know you haven't read, Hadith, Muhammad's Legacy in the Medieval and Modern World by Professor Jonathan A.C. Brown. It's recommended highly by Christopher Melcher, Professor of Arabic and Islamic Studies at Oxford University, as well as Sheikh Hamza Yusuf at Zaytuna College. And I'm just referring just a tiny little fragment of a point here on page 2122, where Dr. Brown writes about something called a sahifa, which he defines. Where are we? Sahifas, these are collections of, they're like small notebooks, he says. Before paper was discovered or made available, I should say, in the Arabian Peninsula, that came later from China, there were these things called sahifas, these small notebooks compiled and written on papyrus and parchment and so on. Anyway, he says on page 22, Jonathan Brown says, an example of a sahifa that has survived intact today, that's the writing of this book in the 21st century, is the sahifa of the successor. This is someone who came after the Sahaba, the companions of the Prophet, the successor, Hamad bin Muhabir. And he died approximately 747 of the Common Era, or 130 after Hajj. This contains 138 hadiths from the Prophet via Abu Huraira. Abu Huraira was probably the most prolific transmitter of the Prophet's own hadith. I think it's like 5,300 according to Dr. Brown. So we actually have physically the actual sahifa of the successor Hamad, who was the direct pupil or disciple of Abu Huraira himself, who was obviously a companion of the Prophet. So that goes back right to the time of Muhammad. Now, Bukhari and Muslim also use these hadiths in their Sahih collections, these authentic collections of hadith that they compiled a little later. So there's just one example of historical evidence, shall we say, that goes back to the Prophet, containing hundreds of hadith. So as
And I'll just mention one more example. So I'm just I won't go into too much details, otherwise it may become a bit complicated. But I'll just briefly mention one study by Harold Motzky, who passed away, I think, a couple of years ago or 3 years ago. So this is just a summary of his analysis of the Musannaf of Abdul Razak as-Sanani. So Abdul Razak as-Sanani, he died 211 after Hijrah, so that would be 827 CE. He was a student of Malik, who died in 796 CE, and he lived in Yemen. So his Musannaf. So firstly, Musannaf is Musannaf are books which are organized topically. So under various topics, you have the relevant material. So it contains around, I believe, 18,000 reports. And Harold Motzky, in a study, looks at a representative sample. So that is 21% of the material. He subjects that to intent study. So that's 3,810 reports. And he uses a methodology, so, we would call it source criticism. And what he does is this. It's a very intuitive exercise, and it's a very logical exercise. He looks at the immediate informants of Abdul Razak. And he looks at the distribution of the material among his informants. Just to give you an idea, informant one, so someone whom Abdul Razak is claiming to have received his information directly. Informant one, 32% of the total material is attributed to informant one, 29% to informant two, 22% to informant 3, and only 4% to informant number 4. I won't be naming them. And he attributes 13% of the material to 90 different informants, among them famous scholars. So 0.7 material approximately is attributed to Abu Hanifa, and only 0.6% to Malik. And he then asks logical question. He looks at all of these informants one by one. He looks at the informants of the informants and looks at the distribution of the material there. And he says that, these are very, this is very idiosyncratic. And the point that he's making is that we would have expected the transmission structure of the sources to be similar if this was assuming it was being forced. But that is not the case. Why is it that the material is distributed in, highly divergent ways, in idiosyncratic ways? Would forgery have produced highly divergent collections, or would it have likely produced more uniform and consistent distribution of material? He also looks at, at the statements of the various informants. Sometimes the informant, they quote, sometimes Abdul Razak, for example, quotes someone anonymous. And he says if Abdul Razak was making it up, why is he quoting an anonymous individual? Why is he not attributing his material to, a heavyweight source?
Exactly.
Likewise, sometimes Abdul Razak and his informants and the informants of the informants, they quote material and then they say, that maybe he said this or he said that. They're not sure about the wording. Would a forger likely do this, or would a forger be likely more certain about the wording? There are times when Abdul Razak indirectly quotes his direct informants. So there is a guy who he quotes directly regularly, and then you come across certain reports where he quotes someone else who quotes this person. And the question is, why is this happening? Then you also come across cases where Abdul Razak and his informants and the informants of the informants. So Momotsky is looking at all of these various levels. And what happens is that they might quote someone, and then they would express their disagreement with their with that cited opinion. And they say, but I think this is likely the case. And again, the question is, once you look at all of these various bits and pieces, Motzky gives many examples of these, that why is this happening? And the question is this likely the work of a forger? Or is it more likely that this is authentically being cited, and the people are really many times not sure about the wording? Sometimes they are quoting people anonymously also, And there are times, and why is it that they're not attributing their material to the heavyweights of the time? Let's say if you and I happen to be Christian forgers of material, it would make sense if we are attributing our material to, let's say, the Apostle Peter, and to John and to other people. That is not the sort of thing which is taking place here. So Motsky's conclusion at the end is that this material can be viewed, at least the material which he has examined. He's not making a generalized comment about the entirety of the Musannaf, but he's saying that this material can be accepted as a source of first century hadiths. That you can that this material can be taken as a source of first century hadiths, that you can glean information from here which was already circulating in the first century. And subsequently in his essay he gives a few examples of where we may be able to acquire information about the historical Muhammad also from certain hadiths. Not all of the hadiths quote the teachings of Muhammad or his statements, but when they do, at least the examples which he investigates, he says that we can actually at times even go back to the historical Muhammad. Nonetheless, overall, he's saying that this is not stuff that is made up. This was already circulating in the first Islamic century.
Wow. And that's how many hadith? What, 21% you say of a total? Sorry, how many?
So the total number of reports are 18,000. He examines 21%. 3,810 reports. So he's not saying that the material which he hasn't examined, that his findings would hold through there also, would be applicable upon all of it. He is very careful to say that, look, the material which I've examined, these are the reasons for supposing that this is not just forced stuff, that this was circulating in the first century, and these are actual informants, that when Abdul Razak is claiming to receive information from particular individuals, that we should accept that, and likewise we should accept the same for his informants and the informants of the informants, and so on.
So just to summarize, just for me in a very simple way, we have the Quran now, which is securely dated, according to what you're saying, and also Dr. Sidki to me also before, securely dated now to the first century of the Islamic era. We have the Sahifa, according to Professor Jonathan Brown, at least those 130 odd hadiths are securely dated now back to Abu Hanifa himself, a very senior companion of the Prophet. And now Harold Motsky, very senior Western German hadith expert, saying that these several thousand hadiths could well go back to the first century. So we have a growing body of historical possibilities when it comes to...
And just one more research, which I'll just very quickly mention. That is the work of Gregor Scholler and Andreas Gorky at the University of Edinburgh. That's where Andreas Gorky is. So they examined the letters which are attributed to Urwa ibn al-Zubair. So there are 9 letters which are attributed to him. He died in 93 to 94 after Hijrah. That's 711, 713 CE. He is the younger brother of Abdullah ibn Zubair, and he is the son of the companion Al-Zubair ibn Awam, who died in 36 after Hijrah, and he is the grandson of the first caliph, Abu Bakr. His mother, his mother is Asma, and his auntie is the wife of the Prophet Aisha. So this is the nephew of Aisha, Urwa ibn Zubair. So Gregor Scholler, they and Andreas Gorky, they look at the letters. There are 9 letters which they believe are authentically from him. That a lot of information here does go back to him, and it's absolutely reasonable to suppose that Urwa acquired his information from his auntie and from other people who knew the Sahaba and who knew the Prophet also. And so the letters are cited in later works. And as I said, it's their general authenticity is defended by these 2 scholars. Now, Sean Anthony summarizes this material in his book, which is...
What do these letters tell us? Here we go.
Yeah, so this is the book.
Muhammad and the Empires of Faith, The Making of the Prophet of Islam by Sean W. Anthony.
Exactly.
Who's the publisher?
So the publisher, University of California Press.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's a recent book, came out in 2020. And so let me just quote what he says. He says, I must confess that the very process of translating and gathering these texts has mitigated much of my own skepticism about the authenticity of this corpus, or rather, what remains thereof. Page 103. So these are, just a few examples which I've given you. Again, this is not to say that the hadith material, all of it authentic. This isn't even the traditional Muslim view. Their view was that, look at it on a case-by-case basis, and then we decide, and then, we will grade the hadiths. Some would be authentic, some would be da'if, weak, some would be false.
Has always acknowledged
exactly
a major preoccupation, the problem of forged hadiths, and so. And that's why you have the great canonical collections, but particularly the Sahih collections of Muslim and Bukhari, because they develop quite sophisticated science to discriminate those which are reliable, those that aren't, and those that are forged, and so on. So it's not as if this is a surprise to anyone.
Yeah.
But so
and I will simply end this just to very quickly conclude. I would say, the best conclusion is offered by, again, Patricia Crona. She says, and I'm quoting her, we probably know more about Muhammad than we do about Jesus, let alone Moses or the Buddha, and we certainly have the potential to know a great deal more. This is quoted from What Do We Actually Know About Muhammad from the Open Democracy website. So what I would say is that as far as the historical Jesus and the historical Muhammad projects are concerned, I think that the historical Muhammad project is actually a more difficult project than the historical Jesus one. And the reason for that is that, we're not just dealing with 3 documents. We are dealing with a larger pile of material, and it's extremely, extremely time consuming to work your way through this material. No one scholar can, just exhaustively look at this material on his own. This has to be a group effort. Just to give you an example, when I began my research at Oxford, I was investigating one hadith, and that hadith has something like 350 versions. My aim was to examine all of these versions of the hadiths and then do my analysis and then reach a conclusion. After 6 months, I had to give up because I had to concentrate upon other things, and I thought that fine, I'll look at this. I'll continue with this project later on. But that just shows you how time consuming this is. That you have to look at. Well, I was looking at something like 35 collections of hadiths. The task becomes easier because now there are databases available, so you can do a search and you can gather the material quickly. But to analyze so many versions of a report, that just takes too long. So that's why it's a more difficult process, because there is a lot more available out there. But secondly, you can't simply apply biblical methods upon these sources. If you look at the methods applied upon the synoptic gospels, for example, I would say that they would not be adequate to deal with the hadith material, simply because, fine, you can apply a few methods to look at 3 documents, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. You can even, add to the pile the Gospel of John. But we are dealing with a lot more material, with many more sources. So we need probably more sophisticated methods, multiple methods to investigate, different items. But finally, the historical Muhammad project would be much more promising for the reasons mentioned by Patricia Crona, because we can make more discoveries, we can learn more things, because there is a lot of material out there which is yet to be explored. It's not likely that you would learn anything new about the historical Jesus based on your reading of the New Testament writings, unless you discover new sources, unless you come across, I don't know, any manuscript of a document which is not part of the New Testament canon. Then fine, if it goes back to the 1st century. But as far as you're stuck with the New Testament writings, I don't think that you'll make any marvelous new discoveries. No. So a field of the historical Muhammad project is actually a more exciting one, simply because there is the realistic potential to learn so much more. But it's more difficult.
That's very interesting. So what I conclude from that, and just a very prosaic point, that the idea of the lone scholar, the lone biblical scholar, analyzing in his ivory tower the Gospel of Mark, Gospel of Luke, and so on. Yeah, you can do it. But in Islam, with the historical Muhammad, you need a collaboration, you need a team effort, simply because of the interdisciplinary nature of the material, the diversity of it, but also the sheer quantity of it as well. And it's still to be discovered. But also, thinking of Dr. Sidki, actually, who is the new executive director of the International Quranic Studies Organization. He's an expert on Quranic manuscripts. His background, before he became a Quran scholar, is as a scientist. He's a microbiologist at the University of Chicago. And I mentioned that because there's a cross-disciplinary benefit there. Someone who is an expert in scientific methodology and statistics, which he is as well, can bring a statistical analysis and a rigor to the sheer vast corpus of material there. You mentioned, 21% of that hadith corpus. He can do statistical analyses, bringing that discipline into this study. That's an exciting. It's collaborative. It can move beyond the solitary, dusty old scholar, and you can bring in other disciplines to benefit and expedite this. So that's really exciting. But also, what strikes me is that, so to conclude, really, when we look at the historical Jesus, there is seemingly a big gap between later Orthodox Christian belief about who Jesus was as the second person of the Trinity, God become man, a man who claimed to be God on the one hand, and the fruit of the historical research into the historical Jesus, who is just a man, albeit a great man, a prophet, a teacher, a Messiah, but a Messiah understood in a Jewish sense, not in a later Christian understanding of Messiah as a divine savior figure, in the sense that later Christians understood. So you had this gap, but when we come to the Islamic and Western understandings of the historical Muhammad, there doesn't seem to be any disagreement by anyone that Muhammad thought he was a prophet, understood himself to be a prophet in the tradition of Moses and the Jewish prophets. I say that because if the Quran represents and reflects his own preaching, which we know that it does, then that is what he would have believed, because he was preaching that message, obviously. So we know that he understood himself to be a prophet in the same way that Jesus and Moses was, because the Quran says that. But also all the evidence of his followers and other hadith and so on also suggests that he was understood to be a prophet as well by others, and no more than a prophet. And so there seems to be a unanimity and a universal understanding from the man himself to his followers, contemporary with him and subsequent to him, that he was just one thing, or multifaceted, but one multifaceted reality. But with the historical Jesus, we don't get that. We get discontinuity, that's what I'm trying to say. Radical discontinuity between the history and the later faith, which we don't have in the Islamic tradition. And that strikes me as the most fundamental difference between the historical Jesus and the historical Muhammad in terms of how they were viewed in their respective faith traditions.
Yes, so I would generally agree with this. And I would say that, my feeling is that most scholars would not have an objection to the notion of the Prophet Muhammad having presented himself historically as a prophet of God, as sort of like a viceroy of God, presenting God's message, and that we have access to his preaching. Of course, scholars would disagree over various particular episodes which allegedly took place in his life. Even Muslims disagree over that. But as far as the core matter is concerned, that he is believed to be God's prophet, a human being, that this is what the prophet almost certainly also preached, and that seems to be very straightforward from the Quran itself. There isn't much of a gap here as far as this particular element is concerned.
Which is a key point. Who was Muhammad in terms of their own self-understanding and how that was later perceived by their followers.